The trigger clicked empty. Sergeant Ray Holmes squeezed again. Nothing. He'd burned through all 2,672 rounds, chasing German bombers across the London sky. Now the last Dornier of the formation was banking straight toward Buckingham Palace, with a belly full of bombs. Holmes studied the bomber's tail. Fragile, exposed, almost inviting. A thought flickered through his mind. Holmes shoved the throttle forward. He could feel it. Luck was on his side today. On September 15th, 1940, Sergeant Ray Holmes of No. 504 Squadron RAF thundered into the skies above London, ready to defend the heart of the city from an onslaught of German bombers. Britain had been reeling under relentless Luftwaffe raids for months, and even Buckingham Palace had been bombed just 2 days prior. A formation of Dornier Do-17 bombers from Kampfgeschwader 76 bore down on the capital. Holmes, a former journalist turned fighter pilot, pushed his Hawker Hurricane to its limits as he closed in on the enemy formation at around 16,000 feet. Suddenly, a jet of flame burst from the lead Dornier. The Germans had fitted a crude flamethrower on the bomber's fuselage, a weapon meant for strafing targets on the ground, but it was now being used as in a dogfight, creating one of the most otherworldly scenes in the history of air combat. However spectacular, the flamethrower didn't work as intended at such an altitude. The blast of flame shot out only about 100 yards, and instead of incinerating Holmes's fighter, it spewed a torrent of oil that splattered across his windshield. He recalled, quote, "He spurted out a lot of oil, just a great stream over my aeroplane, blotting out my windscreen. I couldn't see a damn thing." For a few heart-stopping moments, his Hurricane flew on through the dark cloud of oil, the pilot desperately wiping at the slick canopy as his ears filled with the roar of wind and engine. Holmes had attacked the Dornier head-on, and now he realized with alarm that he was far too close to the enemy. As the slipstream finally cleared the oil from his screen, the shape of the bomber's tail suddenly loomed directly in front of him. Reacting on pure instinct, Holmes shoved his control stick forward and dove under the Dornier at the last split second. His Hurricane barely skimmed beneath the bomber's belly, so near that Holmes felt it, quote, practically grazed his head on the underbelly of the German plane. Emerging on the other side of the formation, Holmes steadied his Hurricane while his temples still pounded. The Dornier's surprise flamethrower attack had failed, but the oil had nearly cost him his life. But he wasn't about to let that discourage him. Ahead, the German bomber formation was splitting apart in disarray. Holmes scanned for his next target, wiping the last greasy smears from his goggles as he readied to re-engage. Holmes quickly throttled up, zeroed in on the same group he'd engaged earlier. The second Dornier was attempting to flee after he had sent the third one plummeting out of the sky. Now only two of the original trio remained, and they banked away from London, with Holmes in hot pursuit. Lining up behind the next Dornier, Holmes squeezed the Hurricane's gun trigger. 8 Browning machine guns chewed into the bomber's airframe. Tracers stitched across its wings and fuselage. Suddenly, amid the smoke and debris, a burst of white filled Holmes's vision. For an instant, he thought he'd blown a piece off the enemy's wing. But it wasn't metal. It was silk. A German crewman had leapt from the stricken Dornier, and his parachute billowed open directly ahead of Holmes's Hurricane. The drifting parachute canopy draped itself over Holmes's starboard wing like a giant white shroud, and the hapless German airman was now literally snagged to the British fighter midair. Another surreal scene that not even the most experienced pilots encountered in a lifetime. A desperate tug-of-war at 250 miles per hour over London ensued. The weight of the dangling parachutist and his canopy yanked Holmes's aircraft violently. He thought, quote, "There was this poor devil on his parachute hanging straight out behind me, and my airplane was being dragged." Holmes knew that if he didn't get the parachute off his wing quickly, both he and the German would soon spiral down to earth together. He threw his aircraft into a series of abrupt, violent maneuvers, first rolling left, then snapping right, doing anything to shake the clinging parachute loose. The G-forces of the sudden swings tore at Holmes in the cockpit and sent the German airman swinging like a pendulum behind. At last, the canopy slid free of the wing surface, and the parachute whipped away into the sky, carrying its stunned occupant to an uncertain fate below. Holmes breathed a shaky sigh of relief. He'd narrowly escaped being literally dragged out of the fight. He'd avoided dying in the most unexpected ways possible 2 times in a row, and still he wasn't going home. Holmes righted his Hurricane and scanned around for the Dornier he'd been attacking. The German bomber, now missing at least 1 crewman, was badly damaged and disengaging. Out of the corner of his eye, he spotted the 3rd Dornier bomber, the sole remaining aircraft of the trio. It was turning towards central London, engines roaring at full throttle. At that moment, Holmes realized with dread exactly where it was headed. Less than 2 miles ahead lay the domed palace of the king, Buckingham Palace. Holmes climbed aggressively to gain the advantage over the final Dornier. The German pilot was steering a beeline course toward the area of Buckingham Palace, perhaps intent on a lethal bomb run, or simply struggling with a damaged aircraft. Holmes nosed above the bomber's altitude to avoid its dorsal gunners, and then whipped his Hurricane around for a head-on pass. As he bore down on the oncoming enemy, Holmes squeezed the gun trigger to obliterate the bomber before it could reach the palace. But this time, nothing happened. His ammo belts were spent. In the furious fighting moments before, Holmes had expended all 334 rounds per gun. Now, with the Dornier ahead and closing fast, his guns merely clicked on empty. Holmes had only seconds to react. He thought, with a stab of despair, quote, "Hell, he's got away now." But Holmes just couldn't have it. He decided on a last-ditch act of desperation that virtually guaranteed his own death or serious injury. He would ram the German bomber with his Hurricane. Holmes remembered, quote, "His tail looked very fragile and very inviting, so I thought I'd just take off the tip of his tail." Holmes carefully lined up his left wing to intersect the Dornier's left tail. In theory, a sharp blow to the tail might send the bomber spiraling out of control, without utterly destroying both planes. It was a calculated risk, but in truth, nothing about ramming an enemy aircraft at hundreds of miles an hour could be truly calculated. Holmes steadied his Hurricane into the attack vector. The 2 aircraft hurtled toward each other, closing the distance in seconds. Holmes reassured himself that his sturdy Hurricane could slice through the Dornier's tail like a scythe through wheat. At 11:45 a.m., with Buckingham Palace and Westminster sprawled below, Ray Holmes slammed into the enemy bomber in a thunderous collision. The left wing of Holmes's Hurricane struck the Dornier's tail assembly just behind the twin rudders, exactly where he'd aimed. The impact, at a combined closing speed well over 400 miles per hour, was instantaneous and catastrophic. Holmes felt a tremendous jar shudder through his aircraft, as if he'd hit a brick wall in midair. In the split second of contact, the Hurricane's wing acted like a giant cleaver. It sheared straight through the Dornier's rear fuselage, effectively decapitating the bomber's tail section. The entire aft, including the tail fins and tail plane, ripped away from the rest of the German aircraft, exposing jagged metal and sparking cables as it broke off. For a frozen moment, Holmes thought he had just clipped the tail. He had, quote, not allowed for the fact that the tail fin was actually part of the main fuselage. In reality, the Hurricane had tore away the whole back half of the bomber. The effect on the Dornier was disastrous. The sudden loss of its tail sent the bomber into a violent front flip. Both wings of the Dornier snapped clean off outboard of the engines under the massive G-forces of the tumble. The dismembered bomber, now just a nose and center fuselage, immediately pitched into an uncontrollable spiral dive toward the city below. Most of the crew had escaped moments before. 2 were already deceased from prior attacks, and 2 others parachuted out after the collision. Holmes' daring aerial ramming had succeeded beyond his expectations, but now he was in grave peril himself. For a brief instant, his Hurricane still seemed to be in one piece, but relief turned to horror as Holmes realized the tremendous impact had also crippled his Hurricane. The collision had torn off a large chunk of his Hurricane's left wing and likely damaged the control surfaces. The aircraft immediately lurched into a dive, veering uncontrollably to the left. Holmes yanked at the stick, but the Hurricane did not respond. It was now essentially a falling wreck, nose pointed at the ground in a steepening plunge. Holmes kept his wits enough to know he had to abandon the aircraft. He unbuckled. There was no time to lose. The ground was rushing up to meet him. As his Hurricane spiraled earthward, Holmes struggled to climb out of the cockpit against the fierce rush of the air. He managed to clamber up and throw himself clear of the doomed fighter, only to be caught in a maelstrom of wind. The slipstream slammed him back against his Hurricane's fuselage as it fell. For an instant, Holmes was skidding across the top of his own aircraft, utterly out of control. Holmes was thrashed against the metal skin. His shoulder struck the Hurricane's tail fin hard. Dazed and bruised, but still conscious, Holmes at last felt himself free of the airplane's grip as the plane continued its plunge without him. Holmes fumbled for his parachute ripcord. Seconds ticked by like an eternity. At last, he yanked the cord. The parachute deployed with a sudden jolt that snapped him violently upright in his harness. The force of the chute opening was so abrupt that it tore off his flying boots in midair. Now swinging under a canopy, Holmes could finally catch his breath. He was alive, drifting down over the city he'd fought to protect. Below him, a vista of chaos and battle met his eyes. He watched as the German Dornier, or what remained of it, came crashing down in a roar of wreckage and flame. With its tail gone, the bomber's forward section hurtled earthward and struck near London's Victoria Station, exploding on impact. At the same time, the heavier parts of his own Hurricane were also plummeting down. The fighter's engine and forward fuselage, carrying nearly a ton of metal in its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, plunged almost straight downward at over 350 miles per hour and punched into the ground at the intersection of Buckingham Palace Road and Ebury Bridge Road. Now Holmes had his own landing to worry about. Quote, "I was heading for the electric rails of Victoria Station." He frantically tugged on his parachute rigging lines to steer away from the station's rails. Wind gusts pushed him over a residential area. Holmes saw a row of houses rushing up at him. He was about to collide with a rooftop. He braced himself as he dropped toward a 3-story house, but fortune intervened. His parachute cleared the building, and Holmes came crashing down into a narrow gap between houses. Holmes suddenly found himself dangling in a backyard in London's Pimlico neighborhood, his stockinged feet just brushing the ground. Remarkably, aside from bruises and missing boots, he was largely unhurt. He looked up to see smoke hanging over the city and realized with a mix of triumph and exhaustion that he had stopped the bomber. Buckingham Palace still stood. It didn't take long for Londoners to reach their fallen protector. Air raid wardens and civilians converged on the scene, initially uncertain whether the parachutist would be friend or foe. To their great relief, the man entangled in the parachute lines identified himself as an RAF pilot. Holmes, adrenaline-addled but grinning, was pulled from the garden and immediately hailed as a hero by the gathering crowd. An 80-year-old witness named Jimmy Early, who'd been playing football nearby when the collision happened, described the awe that Holmes inspired. Quote, "All of a sudden, there was a terrific rat-a-tat-tat. We looked up and saw these planes, a small one chasing a larger one. It crashed into the bigger plane and fell from the sky and landed just 20 yards from us." Rushing over to Holmes's landing spot, the old man found the pilot remarkably cheerful after such a harrowing fall. Quote, "He was still smiling. What a bloody hero, to smash into a plane all that way up." We shook his hand, and there were crowds of women all holding him and kissing him. Just a few streets away, at the intersection where his Hurricane had slammed into the pavement, there was now a gaping crater in the road. London firefighters and civil defense crews were already on site, dousing flames and sifting through twisted wreckage. Holmes himself was led to the crash scene of his Hurricane, where he gazed at the shattered remains of his trusty aircraft. The crowds then whisked Holmes off for some well-earned rest. Nearby, on Pimlico Road, the Orange Brewery pub opened its doors to the RAF hero. As adrenaline gave way to shaking exhaustion, someone pressed a stiff brandy into Holmes's hand. He drank, gratefully, the reality of what he'd done starting to sink in. Within an hour, military personnel arrived to take charge of the celebrated sergeant. Holmes was escorted to Chelsea Barracks, where an army doctor examined him. Aside from a bruised shoulder from striking his tailplane and understandable fatigue, Holmes was given a clean bill of health. That evening, at the officers' mess, he was treated to more drinks and recounted his exploits to an enraptured audience of fellow pilots. By nightfall, a taxi returned him to RAF Hendon, where just that morning he'd taken off on one of the most fateful sorties of the war. Meanwhile, not everyone involved in the day's drama enjoyed Holmes's hero treatment. Feldwebel Robert Zeba, the pilot of the Dornier Holmes ran, had parachuted down into Kennington in South London. Unlike Holmes, Zeba was met not with cheers, but with fury. Bitter Londoners, fed up with being bombed daily, set upon the injured German airmen in a vengeful mob attack. By the time military authorities arrived to pull Zeba away, he'd been badly beaten. He succumbed to his injuries the next day in the hospital. That night, London newspapers got hold of the sensational story, quote, "RAF pilot saves Buckingham Palace," ran the gist of the headlines, and Holmes was lionized as, quote, "the man who saved the palace." In a city hungry for heroes during the dark days of the Blitz, Holmes's exploit was pure inspiration. The fact that his self-sacrificial act had occurred in broad daylight over central London and even been caught on film by at least one cameraman made it an instant legend. The Queen of the Netherlands, Wilhelmina, who was in London and reportedly witnessed the midair collision, sent a special congratulatory note to the RAF praising Holmes's courage. The heroic version of events became a part of British pride and military identity. However, decades later, historians began to scrutinize the details of that day, and a less romantic picture emerged. Notably, aviation historians Alfred Price and Stephen Bungay revisited German and British records and challenged parts of the hero legend. According to their research, the Dornier that Holmes rammed may not have been on a final bombing run to the palace at all, but rather a crippled straggler already doomed before Holmes struck it. In this revised account, Feldwebel Zeba's Dornier had fallen behind the main bomber formation, possibly due to engine trouble or damage from other RAF fighters earlier in the battle. Separated from its comrades, the lone Dornier was set upon by multiple British fighters. Cannon and machine gun hits tore into the aircraft, taking the lives of 2 crewmen, the observer and gunner, and forcing the others to abandon the plane. Before bailing out, Zeba apparently engaged the aircraft's autopilot and aimed it roughly towards central London. Thus, by the time Holmes made his final attack, the Dornier bomber was possibly already unmanned, a ghost plane on a crash course. Holmes would not have known this in the heat of the moment. He saw an enemy bomber still airborne and took action. Most intriguingly, this research suggests that Holmes may not have actually prevented the palace from being bombed. On the contrary, he might actually facilitate what he was trying to prevent. During the bomber's final spinning dive after Holmes' ramming attack, centrifugal force caused its remaining bomb load to jettison. Several heavy bomb loads tumbled out and landed near Buckingham Palace, exploding and damaging parts of the building. Indeed, historical records show that on September 15, 1940, Buckingham Palace took bomb damage, windows blown out, plaster torn off walls, though fortunately no royals were injured. These could well have been the bombs from Zeba's Dornier, dropped inadvertently as the plane broke apart in midair. Holmes' own combat report, filed after the action, also raises questions about the, quote, intentional ramming. In his official account, written immediately afterward, Holmes did not claim he set out to crash into the Dornier. He described making multiple firing passes, quote, "I made 2 quarter attacks. I attacked a 3rd time, and a member of the crew bailed out." On his 4th attack, Holmes reported, quote, "A jar shook my starboard wing as I passed over, and I went into an uncontrollable spin. I think the enemy aircraft must have exploded beneath me." In other words, Holmes initially believed that maybe the Dornier had blown up under his guns, causing a shock to his plane, not that he had deliberately or directly collided with it. Later, this ambiguous jar he felt was reframed as a heroic intentional collision. It's quite possible that in the chaos of battle, Holmes did not fully realize in the moment that he had physically struck the Dornier. He knew only that something had happened to send both planes down. Holmes himself, in post-war interviews, embraced the dramatic narrative. By the 2000s, he was vividly recounting how he, quote, "took his tailplane off with my wing." None of these revelations truly diminishes Holmes' courage. Whether the Dornier was manned or not, whether he was meant to crash into it or happened by chance during an attack, the fact remains that Holmes risked his life in an extraordinary act of gallantry. He had no way of knowing the bomber was on autopilot. From his cockpit, it looked for all the world like a live threat about to strike at Britain's heart. 80-plus years later, the story of Ray Holmes and Buckingham Palace still sounds like something ripped from an action film. Over time, Holmes' feat has been told and retold in countless books, documentaries, and even reenacted on screen. Even Queen Elizabeth II, decades later, would single out Holmes' quote, role in the valiant defense of London in a message of condolence upon his passing. In 2004, an aging Ray Holmes, then 89, received an incredible epilogue to his wartime tale. After years of planning, archaeologists and enthusiasts excavated the long-buried remains of his Hurricane fighter from under Buckingham Palace Road, 64 years after the aircraft nosedived into the pavement. Crane operators retrieved mangled engine parts and twisted aluminum from the hole during a live televised event. Holmes watched as pieces of his long-lost plane saw daylight again. In a poignant moment, he was handed the corroded control joystick of his Hurricane, the very one he last gripped on that September day so long ago. Fittingly, the gun button on the stick was still set to fire.